Historically, the West has enjoyed control of world policies. Whether through colonizations or conquests, they've been the dominant force across the globe. In the last video, we discussed how the Western world climbed to its dominance and the tactics it has used to ensure its power. But things have changed, and the East is ready to put countermeasures in place. Welcome back to this two-part video series, where we delved into the West's control of the world in the first part, and now it's time to dive into the efforts the East has made to shift the tide of power. So, join us as we explore how the East is slowly breaking the West's control over the world, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more. Western control over East. After the end of the most devastating war in human history, the US rose to power as the global leader and took on the role of global peacekeeper, setting rules for the economy, trade, and defense for the world to follow, but they were highly based on its philosophy. For a very long time, the Eastern Bloc, or USSR, challenged that power but ultimately failed as the empire fell in the 1990s. After the fall, the US and its Western buddies became the sole power holders in the world. But when you're the one setting out rules for others, you can decide when you choose to follow them and when you don't. Over the past 75 years, the US has violated the same laws that it has set for others to follow, and if anyone dared to question the US, they face severe consequences and destruction. But all of that is changing now. Eastern rise to power. Over the past few years, Eastern countries have also risen to power, and one in particular, China, has grown to the second largest economy in the world, rivaling the US for the top spot. China, along with other Eastern powers like Russia and India, looks at the control of the US as hampering their own interests, especially economic in nature. And to combat this, China has come up with its own Global Civilization Initiative, where it claims no country can impose its values, culture, and model on others, something that the US has knowingly or unknowingly imparted along with being a superpower. The Chinese system purports to be built on common interests, mutual benefits, and opportunistic alliances, and not on values like those of the West, one particular one being capitalist and free trade. It focuses more on alliances based on interests that might also involve sanctions if they hurt the domestic economic system. China has also started planting the seeds of its new system all around the globe with its trade and its investment in infrastructure projects. Not only that, but the country has also taken on the role of peacekeeper in the region, and unlike the US flexing military force to impose its peace, China has diplomatically started peace talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran, further damaging the already declining influence of the US in the region. China lacks what the US has, power over international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, but even that is changing now. The creation of BRICS. Economist Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs came up with BRIC in 2001, describing the four countries' combined economic potential and forecasting that the BRICS would overtake the G7 in terms of GDP by 2050, cementing their position as the world's preeminent economic power. At their first informal meeting in 2006, on the fringes of the United Nations General Assembly, the BRICS laid the groundwork for ongoing cooperation and communication. In 2009, they convened for their first official summit in Yekaterinburg, Russia. And in 2010, South Africa joined them, expanding their GDP even further. Since then, the BRICS nations have held yearly summits to coordinate global policies and strengthen their geopolitical bloc. They've also established economic growth and monetary stability systems, like the Contingent Reserve Agreement, or CRA, and the New Development Bank, or NDB. Trade, development, energy, technology, health, education, culture, and security are just a few of the areas where the BRICS have broadened their cooperation. But what makes the BRICS noteworthy is the fact that the countries involved account for a sizable chunk of the global population, territory, and GDP. Besides having 42% of the world's population, they occupy about 27% of the landmass, and on top of that, they have an estimated $4.5 trillion of combined foreign reserves. As of 2018, they also have a combined nominal GDP of $28 trillion, which is approximately 27% of the gross world product. Their total GDP PPP is over $57 trillion, which is 33% of global GDP PPP. In the geopolitical sphere, the BRICS are seen as the main competitor to the G7 bloc. They've even launched competing projects like the BRICS payment system, the BRICS Joint Statistical Publication, and the BRICS Basket Reserve Currency. Based on non-interference, equality, and mutual gain, the BRICS may also present another paradigm for development and leadership. Speaking of mutual gain, let's talk about their economic aspirations and realities. The BRICS countries are a cluster of fast-growing, politically influential developing economies, and they've been actively rivaling the G7 with their concerns over the East. But just like any other entity, the BRICS nations encounter several obstacles and problems, both from within and beyond. They often deal with issues like corruption, inequality, social unrest, environmental deterioration, and geopolitical conflicts. Additionally, the BRICS countries do not constitute a monolithic bloc. Rather, they represent a spectrum of political ideologies, economic models, and geopolitical priorities. To make matters worse, they frequently compete with one another, like other big nations like the US and the EU. But then again, they've created one positive impact, and it's that they've given emerging nations more options and possibilities, while also adding variety and vitality to the global economy. However, they've also alarmed the West over their development policies and governance standards, and they've threatened the current world order because, when the time comes, these nations have proven that they can put their differences aside and act as one. All of the BRICS countries' hopes and dreams are mirrored in the NDB. A more equitable and inclusive global development agenda is the goal of this lofty endeavor, which seeks to fund sustainable development and infrastructure projects in poor nations like the BRICS. But it also has to deal with a lot of problems and unknowns, like not having a clear vision or plan, not having enough resources and capacity, possibly having to compete with and fight other multilateral development banks, and having different stakeholders with different needs and expectations. Despite all of that, the organization has been actively exhibiting diplomatic maneuvers. The BRICS offers an alternative to the G7 for developing countries and challenges the West's control over the world. Despite their differences in economic progress, political stability, and regional clout, the BRICS nations are united in their pursuit of a multipolar world order. As a diplomatic move, the BRICS have established their own financial institutions, like the Contingent Reserve Arrangement and the New Development Bank, to counteract what they perceive as the G7 countries' bias in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The BRICS and other developing nations, particularly in Asia and Africa, will receive assistance with infrastructure and development from these organizations, which will not impose the same stringent requirements as the Western-led organizations. As members of the Global South, the BRICS nations aim to strengthen their ties with other developing nations and work together on topics like trade, climate change, health, and human rights. Argentine, Egyptian, Ethiopian, Iranian, Saudi, and UAE representatives have sent invitations to several nations to either become full members of the BRICS or to participate as observers or conversation partners at their summits. Now, the BRICS alternative plan for the G7 is complicated and uncertain. The BRICS model, which on the one hand may offer developing nations more possibilities and options, may foster a more diverse and inclusive global governance structure that represents the reality and aspirations of the majority of the world's people. And this has given them the opportunity to expand and compete for global governance. By broadening their membership, the BRICS are sending a message that they want to shake up global politics and pose a serious threat to the G7, a group of countries led by the West. A more multipolar and equitable global order is a shared goal of the BRICS nations, and with their regional influences, it's not out of their reach. BRICS are rivaling the G7 in the US when factoring in purchasing power parity, and if they keep this collaboration strong, the US will lose its most important weapon: trade control. After seeing the success and potential that BRICS offer, more and more countries are looking to join the bloc, including some of the biggest economies from non-aligned countries. And from the looks of it, more and more countries are looking to strengthen their trade with China, rapidly weakening the US dollar as a foreign reserve currency as well as Western control. Previously, countries were afraid to stand against the G7, led by the US superpower. But as more and more countries transact in other currencies, the US will lose the ability to impose sanctions and limit trade for those countries, especially in the East. This would encourage the Eastern nations to represent their values to the world more openly and freely, resulting in a stronger East and a more balanced global balance of policies. Not to mention, they've even lessened the influence of global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank with their own institutions. In addition, they've sent invitations to the Global South to join them, which would help further establish their standing in the global economy. A more varied and inclusive global governance system that represents the reality and ambitions of the majority of the world's people is something the BRICS Plus nations aim to achieve by strengthening their solidarity and collaboration. This will give developing countries more options and opportunities for growth, something that the West's taxes and policies have prevented them from experiencing. To help the BRICS' cause, the West suffering from a waning influence. Europe and the United States have enjoyed total control over the rest of the world from the 16th to the 20th centuries, and many would argue that they still control the world even in the 21st century. Several factors contributed to the rise of the West to global dominance. These included the colonization of lands in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, the rise of modern science and industry, the expansion of global trade and financial networks, the propagation of democratic values, and the West's inherent military and technological advantages. But in the 21st century, we saw big changes, which led to a decline in Western influence over the world, decolonization and independence for numerous nations, particularly in the decades following World War II, were the outcomes of growing anti-colonial sentiment and nationalism in formerly colonized areas. Rival superpowers like China and the Soviet Union rose to prominence during and after the Cold War, posing a threat to Western ideology and dominance and giving Western dominance a run for its money. A more complex and diverse global landscape is giving way to multipolar world dynamics, which paved the way for the creation of BRICS. Because of these changes, the power tide is slowly shifting towards the Eastern countries, and the West can no longer bask in its former hegemony. So, do you think that the BRICS will be able to succeed in their goals of unifying the East, or will the Western influence prevail as they reach out to recruits? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.